Good afternoon, everyone. You are very welcome to our November 2024 HRB Trials Methodology Research Network webinar series. My name is Simone Lepage, and I'm the webinar coordinator. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to our speaker today. Katie Biggs is an assistant director at the Sheffield Clinical Trials Research Unit and a proposal developer and research inclusion lead for the NIHR Research Support Service, RSS Hub, delivered by York and its partners. Katie really is interested and works on making trials more inclusive, and she co-leads the Trial Methodology Research Partnership, so the TMRP Trial Conduct Inclusion Working Group, which is open to anyone if they'd like to join, and has worked on the Include Socioeconomic Disadvantage Framework. So Katie's going to, she'll talk to you today about the title of her talk, Step Up, but she'll be discussing the Access Project and the key recommendations from the Step Up guidance so that we can hopefully all make our trials more inclusive. So before we get started, I'd just like to remind you, I do see that someone has already activated the closed caption option, but for anyone who doesn't know, down at the bottom of your screen, you can activate closed captions for yourself, and please feel free to ask questions. You can type them into the Q&A or the chat box, and we will address those when Katie's finished her presentation. So I will go ahead and let her get started and go off screen when you're ready, Katie.
Yep, great, thank you for that. As I've been introduced already, I don't need to give up all of that talk again, but yep, I'm here to talk about our Step Up guidance that we produced as a result of the Access Project. So there's two different names because the Access Project is a good synonym for what the project was, but then we went to a marketing company to get our website done, and they came up with a better name of Step Up. So we are asking researchers, the trialists particularly, to step up to the challenge of trying to make trials more inclusive. That's the long title, Strategies for Trialists to Promote Equal Participation in Clinical Trials for Underserved Populations. Just as a bit of a background, I'm not sure how much everybody knows, but the NIHR Include project was initiated in 2017 to look at underrepresentation in clinical trials. It identified a range of underserved groups which can vary across the types of study, disease or condition being studied, and it's prompted funders and trialists to make efforts to improve the recruitment and retention of underserved groups by thinking about the way trials are designed. Since then, and just recently, like this month, the NIHR have also changed their application form and other support documents to make sure that researchers are focusing on EDI in their projects. At stage 1, you are expected to consider research inclusion throughout your application. At stage 2, you are particularly asked to think about it in terms of population in the design, and you are also allowed to put a separate budget line in your stage 2 applications that relate specifically to EDI. So hopefully this will help things move forward. But following on from the Include project, several frameworks were developed to help researchers think about barriers of inclusion of particular underserved groups when designing a trial. All of these start with thinking about who your population should be. We've got 3 Include frameworks: ethnicity framework, the socioeconomic disadvantage framework, which I did work on with Heidi Green and Francis Sherratt from Liverpool, or Heidi's from Aberdeen, and the capacity to consent framework, so people who are with impaired capacity to consent. And there's a huge project called the Consult project that relates to people with impaired capacity to consent. There are also quality impact assessments. There's one developed by the NIHR ARC, East Midlands ARC, that is quite often used now for people to assess the impact of their research on groups with the protected characteristics. I understand that socioeconomic status is soon to be added as a protected characteristic in England. I don't know how that happens, but I've heard that. But it is already the case in Wales and Scotland. I am not sure about Ireland, I'm afraid, for our Irish attendees. But there is and these frameworks help guide researchers through thinking through elements of their research and the design that might cause barriers. Sometimes when you're doing that work, identifying the barriers may automatically help you come up with solutions, but there is a lack of practical guidance on how to implement these frameworks. So from this, we developed the Access project. So I work as you heard, I am co-lead for the TMRP inclusivity group. I used to just be a member, and when I was a member, we identified this problem, and quite a few collaborators from that inclusivity group and via our UK CRC network, so the UK networks of trials units, we identified a number of collaborators. So we had Athene Lane, Heidi Green, Sean Treweek, Francis Sheely, Vicky Shepherd, Andy Willis, and Talia Isaacs were co-apps, and Cindy Cooper and the director of my trials unit were all co-applicants and collaborators on the project. And there were 5 project phases for the Access project. We had a scoping review, and there's a link to that publication. Oh no, that's not. That publication is about the guidance of the whole design. The other link will be on the next page. We did some roundtable discussions that weren't really roundtable. They were all online because it was in 2021, 2022. So that's what people were doing. Where we gathered insights from a range of stakeholders, including clinicians, people who recruit to trials and work on trials, people who work with underserved groups in other areas, and lots of patient and public involvement. We then used a lot of the findings from the scoping review and the roundtable discussions to theoretically redesign 3 trials that were funded by the NIHR. We looked at their protocols and their PICO, and came up with elements that we could do based on the strategies that had been up. And then that led to a number of recommendations that we'll go through, but then we did some interviews to further explore how the implementation challenges around those recommendations. And after that, we did the guidance development and collated all the findings into the step-up guidance. And as you can see, it's very important. Public contributors and the Access team provided input throughout the project. We didn't actually have a public contributor on the team, which would definitely not be the case if we did it again. We're much better at including patient and public contributors to the project teams. So just a brief overview of the results. So from over 40 experts contributed to the Access project, which, as I've said, was patients and the public, clinicians, NHS research staff, trialists and other academics. A scoping review identified several strategies being used to improve inclusion. The scoping review, which now has the link at the bottom of the page, which will be sent around afterwards. The scoping review, we identified only 7 papers. Now, we were looking at methodology papers, so we weren't looking at trial reports to see what people had done. We just included trial methodology papers. We focused on the UK and Ireland, and we also only focused on 4 underserved groups because as you can imagine, focusing on so many would make the scoping review quite difficult to manage in the scale of this project. It was really, the scoping review was really sort of a jumping off point for us to then open discussions and talk about. But overarchingly found that there's not that much evaluation of strategies that are around. As I said, we included 7 papers. The groups we included were ethnic minorities, people experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage, older people, and people with impaired capacity to consent. From that scoping review, we grouped the strategies that they were discussed into 9 domains that were based on a previous review of strategies, but that review didn't talk about the evaluation of them. And from that, we had recruitment sites, recruitment settings, community engagement, patient documentation, communication between study team and participants, flexibility, incentives, inclusion criteria, and consent process. So those were all the things that were covered in the scoping review papers, but most of them weren't evaluated. Now, all of the papers included some evaluation of the recruitment setting and discussed their successes around the other ones, but they weren't necessarily formally evaluated. We then used all of these strategies to at the roundtables, so we reported on this, and then we just opened it up for a really open discussion. And then the next slide will show you sort of how that went about. Then we used, as I said, these strategies to redesign existing trials. We applied one of the 3 include frameworks, and that led to the key recommendations. Then from the interviews, the key facilitators that we identified were funders requesting information on inclusion. So this recent move by the NIHR is very welcome because they are now requesting this information. I think UKRI already do. Having the time and funding to implement these strategies, having dedicated staff, having the flexibility in trial protocols to add things that might remove barriers, and considering, I think key is considering the inclusion of underserved groups at the design stages. So just to show you a bit more about the steps we took, I want to show you the Jamboards from our roundtable exercise. So we use Google Meet and it has Jamboards sort of incorporated into that. So these were 5 meetings. We put the headings on the top, and that's based on the findings that I just mentioned from the scoping review. We briefly presented that. We didn't want to take up too much time, so we were quite quick with that. And then had a really open discussion about what people were doing in trials in the area. So there were quite a few people who were recruiting staff that were already doing things, training their site staff and various things to try and improve inclusion. And myself and a research assistant added these sticky notes during the meeting so that people could see the recommendations being added, tell us if we'd got anything wrong, and merely clarify. And then we reviewed them at the end to make sure people were happy with what we were saying. Again, we grouped these findings into recruitment sites, recruitment settings, community engagement, patient information, communication, flexibility, incentives, and consent processes. But what we found that came out of these roundtable discussions that wasn't really covered in the scoping review, there was talk of monitoring the people in the study as the study's going on, so you can make changes if necessary. Also monitoring dropout and seeing if that was different for different underserved groups, and training for researchers. Now that's put quite politely. In the discussion around the roundtable, there was more talk of racism and ableism, and some researchers not having the skills to work with underserved groups. So it was really about making sure that people recruiting to trials have the competency for the underserved groups that they are talking to. And a bit more about the stages, a bit more about the trial redesign. I focused on these 2 stages because they're a bit different to sort of other methods, and I thought we might need more detail on them. So here I've just presented the PICO of the 3 trials that we redesigned, and then at the bottom the include framework that we focused on when we were made changes. So the study team, so me and a research assistant, went through initially and made some recommendations based on the framework, and then we again presented them and really discussed the strategies that could be used in these existing studies. And then the key recommendations from these redesigns were then categorized into the findings that and how it's set out in Step Up. So it was recruitment and setting, stakeholder engagement, communication, flexibility, researcher training and hiring, and data collection. And as I said, after that, we conducted interviews to explore how easy it was to implement. So, for example, you might say, ideally you'd take a lot longer to recruit certain underserved groups, but there's always the pressures of the funder and the timelines of the project. So it's about being realistic about the recommendations we're going to make. So now I'm moving on to the actual guidance. So the image on the left actually comes from the kind of infographic from the website, but there is then a report that details further recommendations in this area. So there's 7 recommendations around recruitment and setting. The first one really is about identifying who should be taking part in your trial. So we suggest that people work with clinicians, looking at demographics of the population, the clinical population, and if not, the sort of general population. If there's people that are routinely underserved, thinking about whether they need to be oversampled. There is existing work called the STRIDE project, which can be found on TrialForge website, that goes into this in a bit more detail in terms of ethnic minority groups that you should be including in your research. So it might be that there's further work needed on around other groups. Also, to conduct equality impact assessments or using the include frameworks during trial design and development. We know that timelines in terms of proposal development can be really fast, so we recommend doing this at least a short version of it and then planning it into your setup times if you need to do it in more depth and with more patient groups, but ideally before funding, so that you've got the right funding in your projects. Always consider people experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. A lot that came up in the from patients in the public was that you can't see people with socioeconomic disadvantage, so you can't really identify people. So it's about just making sure your trials would be suitable and don't have barriers. So the obvious barriers would be around people needing time and money to take part in trials, but also literacy. So literacy and health literacy was seen as really, really important. Expand site selection to include sites in underserved areas of the UK. Quite a lot of the time we end up going to research ready sites, ones that are easy and quick to set up, that have a reputation for recruiting well, but then it's very much the same old and the same sort of populations being recruited. So it's thinking about the fact that this may add up to setup time and might need more training. We suggest people observe baseline data from their sites to inform site selection, so going to the sites where the population exists. Assessing your inclusion criteria. It can't be too strict, though some of the implementation findings were around the fact that it needs to be safe. Safety is often a driver for the strict inclusion criteria, and also that you want to be testing the same intervention. So there were queries around using translators and interpreters, and does that change the intervention when it's something like a therapy or something that's quite conversation based. So we need to be mindful that we are testing the same intervention. Excuse me. And considering alternative recruitment pathways. So can you recruit through communities? Can you recruit through outside the healthcare system? Can you advertise in different areas? And then on this slide, I'm sure you've read it while I've been talking, we've also put the budget considerations, so linked to these recommendations. So the budget considerations aren't actually on the Step Up website, but they are on the RSS toolkit. So it's thinking about how all of these recommendations might impact on costing. And as you might have noticed, a lot of it is about time, which is difficult to factor in. But where now the NIHR is asking for a separate line, you could highlight that this extra cost is related to the time needed to recruit underserved groups. A colleague I spoke to not long ago works with community mental health teams, and so sometimes you can take up to 10 contacts to be recruiting some people with severe mental illness. So it shows that it can take longer and be more difficult. The second overarching recommendation is about including stakeholder engagement. So the two key ones in the report are diversifying the patient and public involvement in trial design stages, and then that should be spread through the whole project. If you involve the right people and get the right input to your trial, it will be more accessible. We're suggesting more than one co-applicant, especially to capture more diversity, or you going to community groups as part of your patient and public involvement and engagement. And potentially giving people support and backup to take part. And also prioritising community engagement. So this has come up as being quite difficult, especially if you're sat in a clinical trials unit or sort of a research group that doesn't specialise in a specific area. So you're not talking about the same sort of diseases all the time. But what has come out of a lot of the research I've looked at and done is that we really need to help educate the patients and public around clinical trials and taking part, and why we are looking to recruit underserved groups rather than so making that clear. Again, budget considerations when you are having a more diverse PPI, that you might need to plan more for your meetings, include support. There might be additional support needs and different types of promotional materials and information to provide people. Communication. So when I presented the final recommendations to a PPI panel, they said that simple language is the most important thing that we should be doing to make our research more accessible. It was pointed out that as academics and clinicians, we like to show off with our language to sort of prove that we're clever, and patients do not want us to do that. They don't need us to do that. They need us to use simple language, and also consider layering participant information. So it might be that you need to introduce somebody to research first and not go straight into, oh, we're doing this trial. So thinking about layering the patient information. We all know that you have to get approval from research ethics committees. So people do need the full information sheet, but it's about layering it and using videos that might help people understand it a little bit better. Tailoring communication for different groups, using easy read versions when needed. Even though this tends to be used in disabilities, it can help people with low literacy and low health literacy understand the information, using translations, use videos to supplement the information, and it must be costed because they are not cheap. Translation of written materials is unlikely to be sufficient on its own, so using interpreters throughout the trial, not just at consent as well. They need to be incorporated into other places where you're having patient contact. There was quite a lot of discussion around reducing the power imbalances to increase trust. So mistrust is quite a big barrier for a lot of groups. Using lay language, as I said, and consider using first name terms, though there were also quite a lot of people that like to call doctors, but just giving people the option. And another thing is to really explain to people why you want to include underserved groups, where you might be focusing on them. Show gratitude to patients. So you need to show the patient that they can add value to the trial. Some people can think they're not clever enough, they won't be given the right answers, or it's not me you're looking for. So just really explaining to people why they would add value to your research will help people want to take part. And then you need to strategically plan sharing your trial outcomes with communities, especially the ones you've worked with. One of the biggest complaints I've heard from community groups is people coming in, asking questions, and then never coming back again, or explaining your timeline. So obviously trials take a really long time. So explaining to people that there might not be findings for years, but then still sending the outcomes is very, very important. Flexibility was really just focusing on the fact that one method is likely to exclude groups or one group. So you need to have a number of methods for all the different areas of recruitment, different modes of delivery for the intervention, and data collection. If you have more than one method, you're more likely to not be putting barriers in for certain groups. In terms of intervention delivery, is that possible in different formats? Can you, but again, to consider whether that changes the intervention. Could you give patients videos to help with certain stages that they can refer to? Can you deliver drugs to their houses? Being flexible with times for clinic visits, including out of hours where possible. Thinking of people that might need to work full time, can't get time off work. Arranging travel and other initiatives up front. So if any equipment's needed, that should be provided to people. Payment systems, especially university, can be slow. So either making it very clear to patients and participants that is the case, or consider other methods, paying for travel, paying for their travel up front, organising taxis, and there are payment cards that can be used, and I think are being started to be used across trials. We also were told quite clearly that reimbursement for your time is not an incentive, that is reimbursement, but incentives were considered to be not the driver of people taking part, but to consider the right incentives for people, and that you would do with your PPI groups. And again, the budget considerations. So just if you're introducing different methods, then you also need to consider not just the cost of that specific method, but the impact on the study manager and the data managers and the site staff for delivering those different measures, making phone calls, sending emails. Researcher and hiring strategies. So we obviously don't have much of an impact on who your trial teams are, but we are very clear that we need to make sure we have the right expertise in a group of people in a trial team. And if you are focusing on a specific underserved group, for example, you should also have that expertise in your trial team. But further than that, we don't often have the ability to diversify our teams in terms of other demographics because of the expertise. So we suggest that you provide training to all your staff, which is relevant to underserved groups that might be important to your trial. This could be cultural competency or training around disability and neurodiversity. Diversifying trial teams, as I said, it's not much in our power, but you can include community researchers to recruit or deliver interventions, or to and work with community groups to help recruit to your trial. So again, budget considerations around co-applicants, training, and having a community researcher. But again, focusing on the time that is necessary to build these relationships and to recruit community researchers. I have a colleague in the RSS who's doing a trial who's just recruited 3 community researchers, and she said it took a lot longer than she expected. Data collection. There are kind of 6 key recommendations. So we need to collect the demographic data that we're talking about so that you actually know who is in the trial. Again, Trial Forge website has some information about the included project, which is around collecting ethnicity data. And I know the Institute of Cancer Research have just done some work around with patients around how we collect some of this data. So there is work going on about that, around that, and that should be coming out a little bit soon. Should be a bit more guidance on that. But basically, if you think an underserved group should be in your study, you need to collect the data to know whether they are. Allowing, again, with the flexibility, allow different methods of data collection. Strategically plan outcomes and analysis. So if you've got quite a lot of outcomes that and people are finding it difficult to complete it, then maybe you focus on the primary outcomes, or certain outcomes that you so that people can still take part, even if that burden is a bit too great for them. And also to consider proxy outcomes. Now, ideally, we do always want the participant's voice, but there may be situations where it's not possible. So to consider the proxy outcomes and providing sort of additional support for data collection. So whether people need an extra visit or just an extra person supporting them to help with the understanding of the questionnaires, or a translator or an interpreter. We should be monitoring demographics throughout the trial, especially ones that are important in terms of the underserved groups that we've identified, and then make changes accordingly as you can. I mean, normally the pressure on recruitment is just too great to do anything else, but monitoring it and talking about it and highlighting it to site staff would still be a bit better than what the current practice is. Maybe not for everybody. Collect data on reasons for participant dropout. Obviously, this needs to be in line with people's right to withdraw, but it would be, if you notice that certain groups are dropping out more, it might be good to try and investigate that, considering a sort of sub-project around people withdrawing, if that is likely to be an issue for your intervention. And then lots of patients the public did say to us, if you're collecting all these demographics, then you also need to look at analysis by subgroup and by these characteristics. And I'm sure you can imagine, if you're trialists, that lots of people aren't happy with that, because subgroup analysis can be interpreted and used quite badly because it's not powered. So it really needs to be made clear to everybody that it is just a sort of exploratory, and that you shouldn't be inferring from some group analysis. But putting that information in your trial report can help with sort of meta-analysis as well down the line. So it might not be powered in your study, but in terms of meta-analyses, including data by characteristic could help with that down the line. So they're the main recommendations. but just wanted to sort of talk through the next steps with you. So as I mentioned earlier, and from the scoping review, not a lot of this has been evaluated. So lots of these strategies need to be tested, which is potential for methodology projects. I'm working on one called Invite. It's an RFPB grant led by Kirsty Roberts at the University of Bristol that's looking at the use of translation and interpretation in trials units. There are certain SWOTs as SWOT repositories that details studies within trials that can be designed or adapted from existing ones. So there's, for example, SWOT 15 is just the use of videos, but you could adapt that to see how whether it has an impact on recruitment and retention of underserved groups. And there are some specific SWOTs around translated videos and some other translated information that are in the repository. Quintet recruitment interventions, also from Bristol, the Bristol methodology group, can be adapted to focus on underserved groups. So they do a lot about sort of in the pilot stages of projects, they look at recruitment and screening logs and interview people and record consent conversations to see if recruitment strategies could improve recruitment, and that can be adapted to focus on underserved groups. And then, as I highlighted, people were very clear that our language needs to be a lot more simple language, simple concepts. And as I am aware, there's not much work done in consent conversations. Again, I know Francis Sherratt from Liverpool has done some around socioeconomic disadvantage, but there could be quite a bit of work done around how we have conversations with people when we're recruiting them. So there's some links, but I think these are going to be sent around. And I can add a few more, like the Quintet and some other ones that I've mentioned. And then just the acknowledgements quickly. So thank you to everybody who took part. It was a lot of patients in public. Really, people seemed really happy to be involved, but a lot of people spent quite a lot of time at some of our meetings talking about all the issues and barriers that they've seen and potential solutions. We were funded by the NIHR CTRU support funding scheme, and here's your disclaimer that this is not their views. And then yeah, that's it. So any questions on that?
Thank you very much, Katie.